Welcome to Crimson Legacy Historians, where the past is not just remembered, but brought back to life with depth and clarity. The fire is dead, but the executioner is panicking. It is May 30th, 1431, in the center of Rouen. A man who kills for a living is frantically raking through the black piles of ash. He has a serious problem. He has just burned the prisoner 3 times in a row, using enough oil and sulfur to melt iron. Yet the evidence refuses to disappear. Pushing aside the charred wood, he stares in horror. There, sitting in the debris, is the heart. It is red, full of blood, completely untouched by the flames. Terrified that the mob will see this as a miracle, Geoffrey grabs the still warm organ, shoves it into a sack along with the ashes, runs to the Mathilde Bridge and hurls the entire mess into the River Seine. He watches the water swallow the last physical trace of Joan of Arc. Geoffrey later collapsed, convinced he had murdered a saint. But his English paymasters did not care about his soul. They cared about containment. They needed this 19-year-old girl to be absolutely, irrevocably deleted from existence. They did not just want her dead, they wanted her erased. This level of fear requires an explanation. Empires do not usually panic over illiterate teenage girls. But Joan was different. She was a glitch in the medieval matrix. In the 15th century, God chose kings. Kings chose generals, and peasants obeyed. Joan grabbed a sword and short-circuited the entire system. She forced the English military machine to look at a farm girl and see a monster. To understand this fear, we have to look at the world that created her. Forget the romantic paintings of knights and castles. The France of 1412 was a slaughterhouse. The 100 Years' War had been grinding on for 3 generations. It had turned the countryside into a graveyard. Wolves were literally entering the city of Paris to drag corpses out of shallow graves. The French king Charles VI was insane. He was convinced he was made of glass and would shatter if touched. The crown was bankrupt. The army was broken. The country was split in a vicious civil war between the Armagnacs and the Burgundians. Hope was not just in short supply. It was extinct. The people had resigned themselves to a slow, painful death as an English colony. Then, in the muddy village of Domremy on the far eastern border, a 13-year-old girl stopped playing in the garden. She stood still. She looked toward the church, and she listened. She did not hear the wind or the birds. She heard a command that would eventually lead her to the fire in Rouen. The impossible was about to begin. To understand the Savior, you first have to understand the hell she was born into. The rot started at the very top. In 1420, the throne of France was occupied by Charles VI, a man known to history as Charles the Mad. His psychosis was not a secret, it was a national tragedy. During his episodes, he forgot his name. He forgot he was king. He refused to bathe for months. Most famously, he suffered from a delusion that he was made of glass. He inserted iron rods into his clothes to prevent himself from shattering into pieces if someone bumped into him. With a glass king on the throne, the wolves began to circle. The French nobility did not unite to protect their sovereign. They tore each other apart. 2 factions emerged, turning the country into a slaughterhouse of civil war. The Armagnacs, who supported the royal line, and the Burgundians, who allied themselves with the English. This was not a polite political disagreement, it was a blood feud. In 1419, the leader of the Burgundians, John the Fearless, was assassinated on a bridge during a peace meeting with the Dauphin, the future King Charles VII. The Dauphin's men hacked John to death while he knelt. That murder destroyed any chance of unity. Seeking revenge, John's son Philip the Good did the unthinkable. He handed the keys of the kingdom to England. The result was the infamous Treaty of Troyes. This document was the death certificate of independent France signed by the mad King Charles VI, likely unaware of what he was doing, and the English King Henry V. It declared that upon Charles's death, the French crown would not go to his son, the Dauphin. Instead, it would pass to the King of England. The Dauphin was disinherited, declared a bastard, and banished from succession. Legally, France ceased to exist. It was now just a large English province waiting for the paperwork to clear. This geopolitical nightmare trickled down to the muddy reality of the peasantry. Enter Domremy. Joan's village was not the idyllic pastoral setting often depicted in movies. It was a localized war zone. Domremy was a tiny island of Armagnac loyalty surrounded by hostile Burgundian territory. The villagers lived in a state of constant, low-level terror. They slept with one eye open. When the warning bells rang, they did not pray. They grabbed their cattle and ran to a fortified island in the river to hide from raiding NG parties. Joan did not grow up in peace. She grew up watching smoke rise from neighboring towns. She saw the refugees. She knew the smell of burning thatch. The 100 Years' War was not a story to her. It was the reason her father fortified their home. In this environment, the Dauphin Charles, the man she would eventually fight for, was a distant, pathetic figure. He was hiding in the south in the Loire Valley, paralyzed by indecision and poverty. He was a king without a crown, a leader without an army, a man without a spine. His enemies mocked him as the king of Bourges, a ruler of nothing. The English held Paris, the Burgundians held the East. The English army, arguably the most disciplined fighting force in Europe, was slowly tightening the noose around the remaining French territories. They were preparing for the final strike that would cross the Loire River and crush the last resistance. Logic dictated that France was finished. The math was simple. England had the money, the men, and the momentum. France had a madman, a coward, and a civil war. Into this vacuum of leadership, something else had to step in. If men could not save France, perhaps something else would. Back in Domremy, the 13-year-old girl in the garden was about to receive her marching orders. But these voices did not tell her to pray. They told her to fight. The first time it happened, she was 13 years old. It was noon in the summer of 1425. Joan was in her father's garden in Domremy, likely spinning wool or tending to the animals. The sun was high. The air was still. Suddenly a blinding light appeared on her right side toward the church. Along with the light came a voice. Joan was terrified. This was not a comforting religious experience. It was an invasion of her reality. She later testified that she was very afraid. But the voice was noble, and she believed it came from God. Over time the light returned and the figures within it sharpened. She identified them as Saint Margaret, Saint Catherine, and most importantly, Archangel Michael. The choice of Michael is significant. In medieval theology, Michael was not a passive messenger. He was the captain of the heavenly host, the warrior angel who threw Lucifer out of heaven. He was the patron saint of the French royal army. For a girl living in a war zone, his appearance was not random. It was a military recruitment. These divine visions did not speak in riddles. They gave her specific, actionable intelligence. At first they told her to be a good girl and go to church. But as she matured, the commands escalated. They became political. They became strategic. By the time she was 16, the message was no longer about personal piety. It was a mission statement with 3 impossible objectives. First, she had to leave her village and go to Robert de Baudricourt, the local garrison commander. Second, she had to escort the Dauphin to Reims to be crowned king. Third, she had to drive the English out of France. Consider the absurdity of this. A peasant girl in the 15th century could not even leave her village without her father's permission. She had never ridden a war horse. She had never held a sword. She did not know the difference between a flank and a vanguard. Yet the voice of the archangel told her, "Daughter of God, you must lead." Joan argued back. She told the voice, "I am a poor girl. I do know how to ride or fight." The voice simply replied, "It is God who commands it." The pressure on this teenager was immense. She carried this secret for years, terrified of her father. Her father, Jacques d'Arc, actually had a dream that Joan would run off with soldiers. He told her brothers that if that ever happened, they were to drown her. If they did not, he would do it himself. So for years, Joan lived a double life. By day, she was the dutiful daughter working in the fields and sowing. By night, she was in council with the generals of heaven. But in 1428, the war arrived at her doorstep. The English and Burgundians raided the valley again. The time for hiding was over. The voices became urgent. They told her she could no longer stay in Domremy. "Go," the voice said. "Go into France." She had no money. She had no army. She had no support. But she possessed something more dangerous: absolute certainty. She convinced her uncle to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. She was about to knock on the door of the military and demand an escort to the king. The girl was gone. The soldier had arrived. She arrived at the garrison town of Vaucouleurs wearing a red dress and seeking an audience with the commander, Robert de Baudricourt. It went exactly as you would expect. Baudricourt was a hardened soldier who had spent years fighting off English raids. When this peasant girl told him she was sent by God to save France, he did not fall to his knees. He laughed. He told her uncle to take her home and give her a good beating. But Joan did not leave. She stayed in the town, living with a wheelwright's family, going to mass every day, and simply wearing down the resistance of the locals. Her conviction was infectious. While the commander mocked her, his men began to listen. 2 knights of minor nobility, Jean de Metz and Bertrand de Poulengy, were the first to convert. Jean de Metz asked her, "Must the king be driven from the kingdom, and are we to be English?" Joan looked him in the eye and delivered a line that sealed her fate. "I must be before the king, for there is no one in the world who can recover the kingdom of France." Sensing the shift in public opinion, Baudricourt finally relented. He gave her a sword and an escort, but he washed his hands of the consequences. "Go," he said, "and let come what may." Before leaving, Joan made a decision that would later become the central evidence at her trial. She sheared off her hair in a bowl cut and put on men's clothes. This was not just for disguise, it was for protection. Riding 350 miles through enemy territory as a teenage girl was a guarantee of sexual assault. Dressing as a soldier was pragmatic armor against rape. It was a drag performance necessitated by war. The journey to Chinon took 11 days. They rode at night, wrapping the hooves of their horses in cloth to muffle the sound, slipping through Burgundian lines. They slept on the frozen ground. Her escorts later admitted they were tempted to throw her into a ravine to save themselves the trouble. But something about her stamina stopped them. She did not complain. She did not tire. When they arrived at the royal court in Chinon, King Charles VII was skeptical. He was a man crippled by doubt. His own mother had claimed he was illegitimate, the product of an affair, not the son of the king. If he was not the true heir, he had no right to the crown. He decided to test this prophet. Charles hid himself among the crowd of courtiers. He placed a different man on the throne to act as a decoy. The doors opened. Joan walked in. She had never seen a king in her life. She ignored the impostor on the throne, walked straight to the man hiding in the corner, knelt and said, "God give you life, gentle king." Charles pointed to the man on the throne. "I am not the king," he lied. "There is the king." Joan did not blink. "In the name of God, it is you and no other." The court went silent, but Charles still was not convinced. He took her aside for a private conversation. No one knows exactly what was said, but witnesses saw the king's face change. He went from looking bored to looking radiant. The leading historical theory is that Joan revealed a secret prayer Charles had made to God alone, asking for a sign of his legitimacy. She confirmed what he desperately needed to hear. "You are the true heir of France and the son of the king." But words were not enough. The court needed to ensure she was not a witch sent by the devil to trick them. A commission of theologians interrogated her for weeks. Then came the most invasive test of all. Joan was subjected to a physical examination by the Queen of Sicily, Joan of Aragon, and other noble women. They were looking for physical signs of corruption or devil's marks. In the medieval mind, a witch had sexual relations with demons. A virgin could not be a witch. The logic was twisted, but it was the law. The report came back. Joan was a virgin. She was intact. With the theology cleared and the biology verified, Charles VII had run out of excuses. He gave the literate teenager a suit of white armor, a banner painted with lilies, and command of the army. The Witch of Orleans was born. When Joan arrived at the siege of Orleans in April 1429, the city was suffocating. The English had surrounded it with a ring of fortresses, starving the inhabitants into submission. The French commander defending the city was Jean d'Orléans, known historically as the Bastard of Orleans. He was a competent, cautious professional. He planned to use Joan as a mascot, a cheerleader to boost morale while the men did the real work. He was wrong. Joan did not come to wave a flag. She came to take command. Her first act was to dictate a letter to the King of England. It was not a diplomatic note. It was an eviction notice. "King of England," she wrote, "render account to the King of Heaven of your royal blood. Return the keys of all the good cities which you have seized, or I will make a war cry that will last forever." The English laughed. They shouted back from their walls, calling her a cowgirl and a whore. They promised to burn her if they caught her. Inside the city, the friction between Joan and the generals sparked immediately. D'Orléans wanted to play it safe, waiting for reinforcements. Joan woke up from a nap, furious that a skirmish had started without her, and rushed to the walls. She did not understand logistics. She did not care about supply lines. Her strategy was simple, brutal, and entirely modern. Locate the enemy, close the distance, and strike until they stop moving. On May 7th, The target was Les Tourelles, the fortified gatehouse controlling the bridge. It was the linchpin of the English siege. The French generals hesitated. An assault on a stone fortress across a river was suicide. Joan jumped on her horse, grabbed a ladder, and led the charge herself. The fighting was medieval combat at its ugliest. Arrows, boiling oil, and axes in the mud. Then disaster struck. As Joan was scaling the wall, an English longbowman spotted the white armor. He loosed an arrow. It slammed into Joan, piercing her armor and burying itself deep in her shoulder just above the breast. She fell into the ditch. A cheer went up from the English lines. The witch was down. They believed the magic was broken. The French morale collapsed instantly. d'Orléans ordered the retreat. The battle was over. But in the field hospital behind the lines, something gruesome was happening. Joan was not dying. She was weeping from the pain, yes, but she refused to quit. She had the arrow pulled out. Some sources say she pulled it out herself. She slapped a compress of olive oil and lard on the wound, confessed her sins to a priest, and then did the impossible. She put her armor back on. As the French troops were dragging themselves away in defeat, they saw her standard rising again. Joan rode back to the edge of the moat. The sight of this girl, covered in her own blood, returning from the dead, broke the minds of the English soldiers. They were terrified. They stopped fighting a human and started fighting a ghost. "The witch is back," they screamed. Panic spread like a virus. The English commander, Glasdale, the man who had mocked her hours earlier, tried to retreat across the wooden drawbridge. The structure, overloaded with terrified men in plate armor, snapped. Glasdale fell into the river and drowned, weighed down by his steel. Joan wept for his soul. But she took his fortress. The siege of Orléans, which had dragged on for 6 months, was broken in 3 days. The English retreated. The myth of their invincibility was shattered by a teenager with a hole in her shoulder. Europe was in shock. After Orléans, the physics of the war changed. For decades, the English had been the predators. Now they were the prey. Joan did not give them time to breathe. She urged the generals to launch a lightning campaign along the Loire River. This was the blitzkrieg of the Middle Ages. In 1 week, the French army smashed through Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency. The English retreat turned into a rout, but the real reckoning happened on June 18, 1429, at the Battle of Patay. For 100 years, the English longbowmen had been the grim reaper of French chivalry. At Agincourt and Crécy, they had slaughtered French knights by the thousands. But at Patay, the script was flipped. The French vanguard, led by La Hire and Poton de Xaintrailles, caught the English archers unprepared before they could plant their defensive stakes in the ground. It was not a battle. It was an execution. The French heavy cavalry thundered into the vulnerable archers. The English army was annihilated. Over 2,000 English soldiers died. The French lost only 3 men. The invincibility of the English military machine was left rotting in the open fields. Yet with the road open, Joan insisted on the most dangerous move yet. A march deep into enemy territory to Rheims Cathedral. Tradition dictated that a king of France was not truly king until he was anointed with the holy oil at Rheims. But Rheims was deep inside Burgundian territory. The generals called it suicide. They wanted to clean up the Loire Valley. Joan overruled them. "We go to Rheims," she said. What followed was the bloodless march. As the royal army approached, city after city that had sworn loyalty to the English, Troyes, Chalons, Rheims, simply opened their gates. They did not surrender to Charles's army. They surrendered to Joan's legend. They were terrified of the witch, or awed by the saint, depending on who you asked. The resistance evaporated. On July 17, 1429, the impossible happened in the Grand Cathedral of Rheims. Charles VII was anointed with the holy oil. He was no longer the Dauphin, or the King of Bourges. He was the King of France by the grace of God. Joan stood right beside him at the altar, holding her banner. It was the apex of her life. In less than 6 months, a peasant girl had taken a disinherited fugitive and placed a crown on his head. But look closely at this moment. This is where the tragedy begins. As the holy oil dried on Charles's forehead, his demeanor changed. He had what he wanted. He had the crown. He had the legitimacy. What he did not need anymore was a volatile, uncontrollable teenage mystic telling him what to do. The mission was technically complete. For Joan, the coronation was just the beginning. She wanted to march on Paris. She wanted to drive the English into the sea. But for Charles and his advisors, it was time to negotiate. They were politicians. She was a crusader. They looked at her standing there in her shining armor, loved by the people, feared by the enemy. And they did not see a savior anymore. They saw a liability. The king began to sign secret truces with the Duke of Burgundy behind her back. He cut funding for her campaigns. The betrayal was not a knife in the dark, it was a slow withdrawal of support. The phoenix had served its purpose. Now the ashes were beginning to cool. The road to Paris was open. After the coronation, the English were in disarray. If the French army had marched immediately on the capital, the 100 Years' War might have ended in 1429, but they did not march. They waited. King Charles VII, now securing his title, hesitated. He entered into a 15-day truce with the Duke of Burgundy. He believed he could win Paris through diplomacy rather than bloodshed. This was a fatal miscalculation. While Charles negotiated, the English and Burgundians used those 2 weeks to fortify the walls of Paris, dig new trenches and stockpile weapons. Joan was furious. She knew that in war, momentum is everything. You do not give the enemy time to breathe. Finally, after weeks of agonizing delay, the king grudgingly allowed her to attack, but his support was half-hearted at best. On September 8, 1429, on the feast of the Nativity of Mary, Joan stood before the gates of Paris at the Saint-Honoré gate. She did not have the siege equipment she needed. She did not have enough men. But she attacked anyway. The fighting was savage. Joan stood on the edge of the moat, shouting at the Parisians to surrender their city to the King of France. Their response was a crossbow bolt. It struck her through the thigh, tearing through muscle and pinning her to the ground. Collapsing in the mud, bleeding heavily, she refused to leave the field. For hours, as the sun set and darkness covered the battlefield, her voice could be heard from the ditch, urging the soldiers to fill the moat, to bring the ladders, to push forward. She screamed that the city was theirs for the taking, but the commanders on the field, seeing their talisman fall, lost their nerve. Against her will, they dragged her away from the walls and carried her to Fedi. She was screaming in protest the entire way. The next morning, despite her wound, Joan ordered the trumpets to sound. She was ready to go back. She had a plan to attack the city from a different angle. She was already mounting her horse when the royal messenger arrived. The order came directly from King Charles VII. It was not a reinforcement, it was a prohibition. The attack was cancelled. The king ordered the army to retreat to the Loire. To ensure Joan could not disobey him and attack Paris again, Charles ordered the bridge across the Seine at Saint-Denis to be destroyed. He literally burned the bridge to victory behind her. The siege of Paris was a failure, but it was a manufactured failure. The king had sabotaged his own army to appease his enemies. Following this defeat, the royal treatment of Joan shifted from support to containment. Charles showered her with empty honors. He granted her family noble status. They became the Dulis family. He gave her expensive clothes and a household. It was a golden cage. He was trying to retire her. He wanted her to be a symbol, a mascot to be paraded at feasts, not a general commanding armies. But Joan was not built for peace. She was a creature of the battlefield. As the winter of 1429 set in, she watched helplessly as the English regrouped. The truces Charles signed were broken, just as she predicted. By the spring of 1430, the enemy was on the move again, targeting the strategic town of Compiègne. Joan did not wait for the king's permission this time. She could not listen to the politicians while her people were being slaughtered. In May 1430, with a small band of volunteers, she rode out of the royal court to defend Compiègne. She was riding toward her doom. The king did not try to stop her. In fact, many historians suspect he was relieved to see her go. On May 23, 1430, the end began outside the walls of Compiègne. Joan led a sortie to attack the Burgundian camp. It was meant to be a quick hit-and-run operation, but the enemy reinforcements arrived faster than expected. The French were outnumbered. They turned back toward the safety of the city walls. Joan, as always, stayed at the rear to cover the retreat. She was the last one fighting, swinging her sword to buy time for her men to cross the bridge. She expected the governor of the town, Guillaume de Flavy, to keep the gate open for her. He did not. With Joan and a handful of her soldiers still outside, the drawbridge began to rise. The portcullis slammed down. She was trapped against the moat with an army of Burgundians closing in. To this day, historians debate whether Flavy panicked or whether he was following secret orders to dispose of a troublesome general. A Burgundian archer grabbed her by her gold-embroidered coat and dragged her off her horse. She hit the ground hard. There was no divine intervention. No angels appeared with flaming swords. There was only the mud, the shouting of soldiers, and the rough hands of men stripping her of her weapons. She was now the prisoner of John of Luxembourg, a vassal of the Duke of Burgundy. In the code of medieval chivalry, a high-ranking prisoner was a lottery ticket. You did not kill them, you ransomed them. It was a business. The standard procedure was to offer the prisoner back to their own side for a cash payment. Joan waited for the offer to come. She waited for the king she had crowned to empty the royal treasury to save her. Weeks passed, then months. The silence from the French court was deafening. King Charles V, too, did absolutely nothing. He did not offer a single franc. He did not threaten retaliation. He did not even organize a prayer group. He simply ghosted her. To Charles, Joan was a tool that had served its purpose. A living martyr is dangerous. A dead martyr is useful. While Charles sat on his hands, the English were frantic. They could not allow the Burgundians to keep her, and they certainly could not risk her being ransomed back to the French. They needed her. Specifically, they needed to put her on trial. They needed to prove that Charles VII had been crowned by a witch. If Joan was a witch, Charles was a heretic king, and his crown was illegitimate. Pierre Cauchon, the Bishop of Beauvais, and a staunch English collaborator, was dispatched to broker the deal. He traveled to the Burgundian camp with a massive sum of money. The price for the Maid of Orléans was set at 10,000 livres tournois. To put that in perspective, that was a king's ransom. It was enough money to equip a small army. Joan was literally bought and sold like a piece of high-value livestock. During her imprisonment in the castle of Beaurevoir, Joan grew desperate. She knew she was being sold to the English. In a moment of panic, she climbed to the top of the 60-foot tower and jumped. She crashed into the dry moat below. Miraculously, she did not break any bones, though she was knocked unconscious and severely bruised. Later, at her trial, her prosecutors would claim this was a suicide attempt, a mortal sin. Joan argued she was trying to escape to go back to Compiègne. Either way, it was the act of a terrified young woman realizing that her allies had abandoned her to the wolves. The deal was signed. The money changed hands. The Burgundians handed her over to the English. She was chained inside an iron cage and transported to Rouen. The battlefield was left behind. Now she faced a much more dangerous arena, a courtroom filled with men who had already decided the verdict. The trial began on February 21, 1431, in the chapel of Rouen Castle. It was designed to be a spectacle of intimidation. Bishop Cauchon presided over the tribunal, flanked by nearly 70 doctors of theology, canon lawyers, and clerics. Picture the scene. On high benches sat dozens of the most educated, powerful men in Europe, dressed in intimidating robes of wool and fur. In the center, on a small wooden stool, sat a 19-year-old prisoner in shackles. She had no lawyer. She had no witness. She was not allowed to call anyone to her defense. The goal of this trial of condemnation was not to find the truth. It was to prove a point. They needed to demonstrate that her voices were demons, her clothes were an abomination, and her king was a heretic. They threw everything at her. For months, they bombarded her with complex theological traps, jumping between topics to confuse her, asking about fairies, about her virginity, about the specific dialect her saints spoke. They were trying to catch her in a contradiction. Then came the kill shot. One of the interrogators asked her a question that was designed to be impossible to answer. Do you know yourself to be in God's grace? This was a masterpiece of legal malice. According to church doctrine, no human could know for certain if they were in a state of grace. That was God's secret. If she answered yes, she was a heretic, claiming to know the mind of God. If she answered no, she was confessing to being a sinner, and therefore guilty. It was a lose-lose situation. The scribes poised their pens, ready to record her death sentence. Joan looked at them and replied, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God so keep me." The court was stunned. The scribes stopped writing. She had sidestepped the ultimate trap with a theological precision that a doctor of divinity would envy. They were forced to adjourn the session immediately. The illiterate peasant had outsmarted the experts. Realizing they could not defeat her intellectually, Cauchon shifted tactics. He began a campaign of what we would today call gaslighting. This was not just interrogation, it was the systematic dismantling of a person's reality. They kept her in a dark cell, chained by the neck, hands, and feet to a heavy log. She was guarded 24 hours a day by English soldiers who mocked her and threatened her with rape. They denied her the one thing she begged for: Mass and the Eucharist. By cutting her off from the sacraments, they were telling her that God had already rejected her. They wanted her to believe she was already damned. They took her to the torture chamber and showed her the instruments: the rack, the thumbscrews, the hot irons. They told her that her voices were delusions. They told her the king had forgotten her. They twisted her words until she was exhausted, sick, and terrified. The Inquisition records show a trial that dragged on for months. Joan's health began to fail. She was vomiting, feverish, likely from food poisoning or the horrific conditions of the cell, yet she refused to recant. She stuck to her story. "I have done nothing except by revelation," she insisted. Finally, having failed to prove she was a witch, they cornered her on a technicality that seems absurd to the modern mind: her wardrobe. The Bible in Deuteronomy forbids women from wearing men's clothing. Joan refused to wear a dress. Because in prison, her male clothing, with its many laces and tight fit, was her only defense against the groping hands of her guards. Cauchon offered her a choice: submit to the church, sign a confession, and wear a dress, or burn. On May 24th, at the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, facing a screaming mob and the executioner waiting with his cart, Joan's resolve finally cracked. Sick, terrified of the fire, and exhausted by the gaslighting, she signed a document she could not read. She agreed to stop wearing men's clothes. She was sentenced to perpetual imprisonment, with the bread of sorrow and the water of affliction. She had saved her life, but she had lost her soul, or so she thought. She had signed the paper. She was alive, but back in her cell, the reality of her mercy set in. She was to be locked in darkness forever, chained to a block of wood, eating bread and water, listening to the insults of her guards. 3 days later, on May 28th, Bishop Cauchon entered her cell and stopped dead in his tracks. Joan was no longer wearing the dress. She was back in her male clothing. Why? Some historical accounts suggest the guards stole her dress and left her only the tunic and hose, forcing her to put them on to cover herself. Others suggest she put them on voluntarily as a shield against rape, but Joan's own words suggest something deeper. She looked at the bishop and retracted her confession. "I damned myself to save my life," she said. She realized that denying her truth was a fate worse than the fire. Cauchon did not try to save her this time. He rushed out of the prison, reportedly shouting to the English, "Farewell, be of good cheer, it is done." They had trapped her by return. To men's clothes, she was technically a relapsed heretic. The penalty for relapse was automatic death. On the morning of May 30th, 1431, they dressed her in a long white shift and placed a tall paper mitre on her head. On it was written, "Heretic, relapsed, apostate, idolater." She was led to the old market square. The English had built the pyre unusually high, placing the stake atop a plaster scaffold so the executioner could not reach her to strangle her first, which was the customary mercy to spare the victim the pain of the flames. They wanted her to feel everything. As she climbed the ladder, the crowd began to weep. Even the English soldiers were unsettled. She asked for a cross. An English soldier, moved by pity, broke a stick in two, tied it together, and handed it to her. She kissed it and shoved it into her dress against her skin. When the fire was lit, she did not scream curses. She did not beg for her life. She screamed one word over and over again through the smoke: Jesus. She died at 19. Her body was reduced to ash, her heart thrown into the river, and her story was supposed to end there. But you cannot burn a legacy. 25 years later, in 1456, the war was over. The French had won. King Charles VII, finally secure on his throne, realized he had a problem. He had been crowned by a woman officially condemned as a witch. To clean up his own reputation, he ordered a retrial. The nullification trial. Commissioners traveled to Domremy, Orleans, and Rouen. They interviewed the surviving witnesses, her childhood friends, the old soldiers who fought beside her, even the scribes who recorded her trial. The truth came pouring out. The court declared the original 1431 trial corrupt, illegal, and void. They described Joan as a martyr and declared Bishop Cauchon a heretic. It was a total vindication, but it was also one final use of Joan by the monarchy. Even in death, she was a political tool. So what are we to make of Joan of Arc? 500 years later, the Catholic Church canonized her as a saint. Today, she is a feminist icon, a nationalist symbol, and a pop culture legend. But strip away the halo and the statues and you are left with something far more compelling. You are left with a girl who saw the world as it was, broken, violent, and unjust, and decided she could fix it. She did not wait for permission. She did not wait for a man to save her. She stepped into the fire because she believed in something bigger than her own survival, in a world that often tells us we are too small, too young, or too powerless to make a difference. The girl from Domremy offers a terrifying, beautiful counter-argument. She proves that conviction, when pure enough, can bend reality itself. The fire at Rouen consumed her body, but it lit a fuse that never went out. The English burned her to make us forget. Instead, they made her immortal.